Well, let me take you back to the chalkboard, because I think most Americans don't know much about NATO other than a passing reference to it in their school history books. That is, if they taught you American history. And I want to take you through how we got to this point, because the NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why does it matter? Does it even still matter? Here's how it started. Go back to 1948. Europe is a pile of rubble from World War II. Germany has been divided into 4 different zones here. You had the French zone. That's where all the lazy people who said, I surrender. They went there. Then you had the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain. So it was carved up. And inside the Soviet zone, it's also divided into 4 zones, controlled by each of the allies. The Soviets decide to choke the other allies out of Berlin with a total blockade of the Western zones for the city. So the U.S. and Britain respond with the Berlin airlift. It is I think, one of the greatest things we ever did. It was round-the-clock planes dropping supplies over the western half of Berlin. That kept 2 million Berliners alive and free. The Berlin airlift involves more than 277,000 flights over 15 months, and it sends a clear, defiant message to Moscow. It lights the fuse for the Cold War, but says, we're standing. April 1949, months before the airlift ended, representatives from 12 European nations, plus Canada, because I don't want to leave Canada out. I mean, they're cute and everything, but they're kind of like Europe's understudy, you know? They get together in Washington, D.C., and they form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The idea is really simple. We all band together for protection and help stop the spread of Soviet communism across Europe. We don't want to sit on our hands as, Poland is invaded by another, Hitler, or in this case, the Soviets. Now, the key to the whole treaty is what's called Article 5. This says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members. It's a pinky swear. It's the glue that holds NATO together. No matter if we like France or not, it doesn't matter. If somebody attacks them, we all go in together. It's what keeps more and more European nations joining NATO over the next 75 years, and it is what makes Ukraine desperate to join. Now, keep Article 5 in mind, because we're going to come back to that later. 1950, we're at the Korean War. Not everybody in the U.S. government cheers for NATO, okay? During the Senate debate, the Ohio Republican Robert Taft, who's not the guy to be confused with the so fat he had to have his own bathtub in the White House. That's a different Taft. He really opposed the treaty. And he said, quote, this whole program, in my opinion, is not a peace program. It's a war program. The whole tendency of this program is toward a third world war instead of away from a third world war. We are inevitably starting an armament race. And it's amazing how relevant his words are right now. Is NATO actually a peace program or a war program? I don't know. Why have we chained ourselves to potentially endless fights? And at the end, very least, to endless funding for the protection of others. I mean, I'm all for, hey, let's all help each other out, but that's not the way it is. Alliances can be really important, but they also can drag you into quicksand. The first big NATO test arrives a year later when North Korea explodes. North Korea, supplied by the Soviets, storm into South Korea, and NATO realizes the Cold War could turn hot at any moment in Europe. So the U.S. is the urgent driver of the NATO military buildup. Troops, tanks, planes, bases, and a real game plan. We go in there. But by 1951, they have to set up something called SHAPE. This is when that's established. I didn't even know about this until my researchers were like, hello, SHAPE. Dummy. And I'm like, yeah, I know about SHAPE. I didn't know anything about SHAPE. It stands for Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And it was in Paris. SHAPE would be the nerve center of NATO. Now, why didn't I know that? Because the headquarters are not in Paris. Where are they? Where are they? They're in Brussels, right? That's not France. Listen, 1955, a game-changing move. West Germany joins NATO. It's incredible. Just a decade after the Allies took down the Nazis, now half of the old Germany joins NATO. And that means rearming Germany, which France hates. And I might say this time for good reason. They think it's way too soon to be giving Germans weapons. But the U.S. presses ahead with the plan, insisting that it is necessary to have a buffer against Soviet aggression. Adding West Germany to NATO then triggers the Iron Curtain and sets the whole Cold War map in stone, West versus East, with everyone's finger on the button. There's a lot of freaking out right now about President Trump threatening to pull out of NATO. But there is a precedent for it. France. How do we not know this story? Maybe you do, but I didn't. 1966, France withdraws from NATO. President Charles de Gaulle pulls out of NATO's military structure. Why? Because he's sick of, there's no reason why America should call all the shots. You never win a war. We do. I don't know, maybe you should shut the pie hole. He's trying to reassert France's sovereignty. He says, we do not want to be a U.S. puppet. Huh? This means no NATO troops in France, no NATO bases. Shape has to move from Paris to Belgium. France technically stays part of the North Atlantic Treaty, just no military. How convenient for France, isn't it? We're still there. In case somebody comes and tries to hit us in the nose, maybe you can send a jet over or something. France doesn't rejoin the military side of NATO until 2009. Okay, spoiler alert. The Soviet Union implodes in 1991. Cold War is over. That was the purpose of NATO. Why is it still happening 40 years after? It stopped everything for 40 years. We never fired a shot. It was good. But then, 1994 and civil war in Bosnia, NATO intervenes with airstrikes, try to stop the bloodbath, enforce a no-fly zone. It was declared by the UN Security Council. Oh, that's going to work out well. In 1999, NATO steps into a conflict in Yugoslavia, dropping bombs in Serbia to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Then, September 11th, 2001. For the first time in history, NATO history, NATO invokes Article 5. An attack on the U.S. is an attack on all NATO countries. NATO is suddenly part of the global war on terror. That's the history of NATO in a nutshell. So what is Vladimir Putin's beef with NATO? Where does that come from? Well, you have to go back to the 1990s when the Soviet Union dies. Vladimir Putin, ever notice when he walks, the hand where his gun used to be doesn't swing? He walks like this because the guy was KGB, all right? Part of Putin's soul dies a little bit when the Soviet Union dies. He's a career KGB guy. He's stationed in East Germany. Oh, and you will talk. When the Berlin Wall comes down, he thinks that's a mistake. By the end of the decade, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland join NATO. And then the worst of all, from Putin's standpoint, the former Soviet states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania also joined NATO in 2004. Putin sees this and he's like, this is the West. This is NATO marching right into Russia, right in our front yard and pitching a tent and saying, dare us. He thinks the fall of the Soviet Union was a mistake, but he also resents NATO. It has been simmering since the end of the Cold War, still simmering today, because when the wall came down, George H.W. Bush promised, we're never going to have NATO move your direction. And then it happens over and over and over again. And as Putin said recently, why should I believe you're not going to? At a summit in April of 2008, NATO agrees to eventually make the former Soviet state of Georgia a full member of NATO. 4 months later, Russia invades Georgia. NATO condemns the invasion, has plenty of meetings about it, but it's now kind of becoming a little like the UN. Nobody does anything because Georgia's not a NATO member. Putin was testing the waters for his next move in 2014. He snatched Crimea from Ukraine. NATO ramps up the rhetoric again. We do nothing. He just keeps going. NATO doesn't do anything. See, this is why you don't draw little lines in the sand and then let them cross and you erase that line. You say, well, don't cross this one, okay? Again, no direct fight because NATO hasn't had Ukraine as a member. Putin wants it to stop to keep it that way, to stop that from happening. That brings us back to 2025. President Trump is now stirring the pot. He's so reckless with NATO, and he's making all the allies squirm with his posture towards Ukraine. Is the NATO alliance valuable to us? Should we be involved in the NATO alliance when it comes to places like Ukraine or Latvia? Can you find it on a map? Or, and it might be important, or is it a chain that is dragging America into somebody else's war? Senator Robert Taft, remember him, 1949. Is it a peace program or is it a war program? Done a lot of good. Is it still